Alright everybody, we're going to move into South Carolina and North Carolina stories. North Carolina story is going to be the Beckler gold coins, 20 mule loads of silver, pots of Confederate gold, the cursed cache of the Yawari Mountains, and outlaw treasure cave near Hendersonville. South Carolina is going to be lost keg of gold, the Indian gold mine DeSoto never found, and the silver mine in Pickens County. Now, the Beckler gold coins. Between 1831 and 1840, a small privately owned mint operated in the remote town of Rutherfordton. It's owned, mined, processed, and coined nearly $40 million worth of gold over a 9-year period. The coins, cast into denominations of $1, $2.50, and $5, were in general circulation in western North Carolina, northern South Carolina, and much of northern Georgia. As United States minted specie became available, these locally made coins were gradually withdrawn from the area economy. Collectors now possess hundreds, perhaps thousands of coins, and many more of them, perhaps millions of dollars worth, are still in Rutherford County. So is the rich mine from which the gold came. Few are aware of it, but most of the gold mined in the United States between 1790 and 1840 came from the western North Carolina and parts of South Carolina and Georgia. North Carolina supplied most of the gold coined by the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia during that period. And according to a 1948 U.S. Geological Survey report, there were about 300 gold-producing mines in North Carolina alone. Now, Rutherfordton, in the western part of the state, about 40 miles southeast of Asheville, was known as America's gold mining capital during the early 1800s. Although most of the gold used for minting U.S. coins came from western North Carolina, U.S. money was, in fact, quite scarce in the region. Because of that, some area residents made their own from locally mined gold. These maverick coins were in common use throughout the region and were generally accepted. Now, in 1830, a German immigrant named Christopher Beckler and his son August arrived in the small community of Rutherfordton. The Becklers had been metallurgists and jewelers in Europe, and they hoped to put their skills to use in the famous gold fields of the Carolinas. Now, the Becklers found a promising outcrop in Rutherford County near Rutherfordton, settled, and soon discovered a rich deposit of gold-bearing quartz on their new land. As they mined the ore, the Becklers decided to open their own mint. They built a roller and a stamp press and began producing a high-quality specie in denominations of $1, $2.50, and $5. Area residents came to prefer the Beckler coins, and they began to be used almost exclusively throughout the region. Now, the Becklers preferred minting their own coins to selling raw and smelted gold to the Philadelphia Mint. Hauling the heavy ore from western North Carolina to eastern Pennsylvania was a long and arduous journey and took time that could have been spent digging gold. Robbers occasionally lurked along the old ore trail, and more than one hauler was killed for his rich load. Now, selling the gold to a broker or middleman meant reduced profit. Thus, Christopher and August Beckler decided to optimize their profit by continuing to fashion their own gold into what came to be known as Beckler coins. They also charged a small fee to mint the gold brought in by other area miners. In a few years, the two men became very wealthy. So for 9 years, the Beckler mine and mint prospered. It has been estimated that $40 million worth of coins at today's market value were made. Most of them went into the area economy, but the Beckler mint was not destined to endure. In 1840, the United States opened a mint in Charlotte, about 75 miles east of Rutherfordton, with U.S. minted specie now more available in the region. The Becklers were pressured by the federal government to cease their private manufacture of coins. The family didn't object, since by that time it had already amassed a fortune. Now, western North Carolinians, however, often insisted on using the Beckler coins. They were preferred by most area merchants and residents, And for well over 20 years, the coins were the most common form of currency in this part of the Appalachians. Now, during the war between the states, Beckler coins were also in demand by the Confederate government. One historian noted that Confederate purchasing contracts often specifically called for payment in Beckler gold rather than U.S. gold or paper money. Now, metallurgical analysis showed that the Beckler coins had a higher gold content than did the U.S. minted coins. They were also more plentiful in the area and more acceptable to merchants and suppliers who had been happily using them for years. Now, as the Civil War raged, even after North Carolina joined the Confederacy, the western section of the state was spared much of the violence that disrupted the rest of the South. Though most of the conflict occurred elsewhere, many families in and near the Carolina Appalachians buried large caches of Beckler coins so they would not be confiscated by roving bands of either Yankee soldiers or rebel bandits who terrorized the countryside. Now, within months after closing down his mine, Christopher Beckler, along with a trunk filled with gold coins, disappeared. He was traveling by wagon to nearby Buncombe County to pay off a large debt. He was last seen at the Paris Gap toll gate, where he stopped to visit with the operator for about an hour. A few days later, Beckler's wagon was found overturned in a deep ravine about 3 miles west of the Gap. His 2 horses had been killed and their carcasses lay near the ruined wagon. Christopher Beckler and the trunk of coins were never seen again. His son August closed down the mine shortly thereafter. August abandoned the settlement near the mine and moved into Rutherfordton, where he opened a shop and made jewelry, firearms, and occasionally, in response to local demand, a few coins, using some of the original rollers and dies. Beset with serious health problems, August Beckler passed away a few years later, leaving his business and his fortune to his closest relative, a cousin, who had come to live with him 5 years earlier. The cousin, also named Christopher and sometimes referred to in the region as Christopher Jr., ran the business for several years. Then he closed it down and moved away, not saying where he was bound. Now, the Beckler coins gradually disappeared from circulation over the years to be replaced by federal specie. As the coins became a part of the region's history, the Smithsonian Institution saw fit to create a display of them. Now, coin collectors considered them valuable both intrinsically and as historical artifacts. Researchers have recently learned that several current Rutherfordton residents still hold hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of the Beckler coins. Interviews have revealed that many of the town's citizens own several hundred of the old coins, which were handed down in their families. These collections of Beckler coins could be worth from several hundred thousands to well over $1 million on today's collector market. Now, the Beckler coins still turn up from time to time. One longtime Rutherfordton resident reported finding hundreds of the coins in a secret hiding place in the concrete-lined chimney of an old house that Christopher Beckler had lived in. The coins were picked out of a square hollow cement chamber. It has also been suggested that many coins hidden during the Civil War were never retrieved and still lie buried in the area. Some of the minting equipment once used by the Becklers is still around. The rollers and the stamp press, both valuable artifacts, are held by local residents. The original dies used in the manufacture of the coins served as doorstops for a Rutherfordton family for 20 years. Now, when World War II broke out, the lady of the house donated them to the government during a scrap metal drive. The location of the original Beckler mine, with its rich, seemingly inexhaustible supply of almost pure gold, was well known for generations. When Christopher Beckler closed it down in 1840, the vein of gold was reported to be as rich and abundant as the day it was discovered. August reopened the mine for a brief time during the mid-1840s, then shut it down for good. Around the turn of the century, the open shaft, regarded as a hazard, was covered over and fenced off. Now, over the years, the town's residents largely forgot the mine, using it as a garbage dump. One Rutherfordton old-timer actually entered the mine around 1945. He claimed he and his father were lowered into the shaft on a rope, and once inside they walked around the excavation for several minutes, discovering artifacts, furniture, and mining apparatus. The old-timer recalled that the air in the mine was bad and smelled strongly of gas. He also reported the shaft was almost knee-deep in water that was seeping in through the fractured rock. He and his father left quickly, and to his knowledge, no one has gone down the old shaft since. Today, the old Beckler mine is a victim of progress. Construction projects and real estate developments have covered the area where it was believed to have been, completely cutting off access to the rich ore that lies below the ground. Now, Rutherfordton is today a pleasant community, attractively sprawled in the shadows of the Carolina Appalachians. It's a typical small American town, and few that walk the streets and travel the highways of this village of some 35,000 souls know that it was once a place where fortunes in gold were mined and minted. 20 mule loads of silver. Now, in far western North Carolina, near the Nantahala Gorge, fast-flowing rivers and streams have carved impressive canyons into the fractured, folded, and uplifted rock that makes up this portion of the Appalachian Mountains. It was there one day in 1896 that an aged Cherokee Indian inadvertently revealed to a young white boy the existence of a long-hidden secret cache of 20 mule loads of silver somewhere near Silver Creek. Now, the young boy was W.I. Grant, born in a small log cabin alongside Wesser Creek in 1881. Grant's father raised corn and hogs on the narrow bottomland by the creek and made a fair living during a time that was hard on most people in the area. Now, with several children, the Grants had little food to spare, and many a meal was postponed. Regardless, the family never turned a hungry traveler from the door. One day in 1893, a trader arrived in the region of Wesser Creek with a wagon load of goods. The Grant family had no money to make purchases, but they did feed a meal to the merchant and his Indian helper. At first, the old Indian stayed in the yard, not realizing he was welcome in the home of white people. But Miss Grant called him inside and invited him to sit at the table and dine with the rest of the family. Though not plentiful, the food was delicious, and the Grants were happy to share their slim fare with their guests. Now, as the trader and Grant's father caught up on the news of the day, the youngster W.I. devoted all his attention to the Indian, and the Indian seemed pleased by the child's interest. The Indian told young Grant that he was called Bigfoot and was a member of the Cherokee tribe. Now, Bigfoot was large for an Indian, towering nearly 6.5 feet. He was about 50, well-muscled and strong, and always carried a big rifle. His feet were the obvious source of his name. After the meal, the trader thanked the Grants, left a few goods and trinkets in appreciation, and he and Bigfoot rode away in the wagon. Now, several days later, the huge Indian appeared at the front door of the Grant cabin. He presented a dressed deer carcass to Miss Grant and told her the deer was a token of his gratitude for the meal and the hospitality given him on his earlier visit. Now, with a slight bow, he excused himself and disappeared into the nearby woods. Now, Bigfoot seemed to know that the Grants had barely enough food to feed their large family, and that the shared meal must have taxed their meager resources. About a week later, young Grant was working in the cornfield with his father when he saw Bigfoot approach, carrying several wild geese by their necks. He handed the cleaned fowl to the older Grant and merely said, "Food." With a smile and a nod, he turned and once again retreated into the forest. Bigfoot made several more sudden and quiet appearances, bringing gifts of deer, geese, grouse, and sometimes fish. The Grants always thanked him for the food and began to ask the Indian to dine with them each time he came. Now, one evening, Bigfoot told the Grants he had left the trader because he preferred to live in the woods instead of getting by like a white man. The Grants told the big Indian he was welcome on their farm any time, and Bigfoot soon became a regular visitor, always bringing food and occasionally toys he had carved for the children. He played with all the youngsters, but W.I. was his favorite. Young W.I. Grant was fascinated by Bigfoot's huge rifle, and he would often run his hand over the smooth, shiny barrel and poke his finger into the bore. Bigfoot told the lad that when he was older and stronger, he would show him how to shoot the gun. And as the boy grew, the two spent much time together in the woods. Bigfoot taught Grant to read animal sign, set traps for small game, and find the finest herbs and greens in the forest. Bigfoot continued his regular visits to the Grant farm over the years and became almost a part of the family. One day, Bigfoot and the boy were sunning themselves on a large rock overlooking Wesser Creek. They had caught some fish, and as the afternoon wore on, the two relaxed, enjoying the late summer weather. While young Grant reclined on the rock, Bigfoot molded bullets for his rifle, heating the metal over a small flame and pressing it into shape using a hand-forged tool he always carried. Now Bigfoot looked thoughtfully around at the canyon, the woods, and the sky, and with a deep sigh told the boy that one day all the deer, geese, and fish would be gone. He added that the Indians would someday be gone as well. Worried, Grant asked what he meant. Bigfoot explained that the area was rapidly filling up with white men, and that when white men arrive, all the game and the Indians are killed off or run out. When Grant asked why, Bigfoot replied that white men were greedy, wanting most of all the silver that was found in these hills. He showed young Grant the bullets he was molding and told him they were not made from lead, but from pure silver. The lad asked where the silver came from, and Bigfoot pointed to a nearby ridge. The Cherokee had had a secret silver mine for hundreds of years. He said in the mountains on the other side of the ridge near Silver Creek, he said the mine was rich with the precious metal. But when white men started moving into the area, the Cherokee closed it down, knowing the white man's unbridled greed for such things. When the boy asked for more details, Bigfoot cut him off sharply and told him it was forbidden for members of the tribe even to talk about the silver. Now when he finished making his bullets, the Indian handed several to Grant and told him to keep them hidden and bring them out only when he was a grown man and Bigfoot was no longer around. About a week after Bigfoot had described the secret silver mine of the Cherokees, young Grant, then 15, walked to Silver Creek and climbed over and through the ravines and hillsides in search of the mine. He found nothing that remotely resembled a mine, but he did discover two primitive smelters that had obviously gone unused for many years. Now Grant knew he was in the right area and rightly guessed that the Cherokee used the smelters to process their ore. The youngster was determined to quiz Bigfoot about the silver mine on his next visit. Now when Bigfoot came the next week, he was drunk and still sipping from a half-full jar of strong homemade whiskey. He and young Grant went into the woods and laid down beneath the large tree. As Bigfoot grew more and more inebriated, Grant took advantage of his state and asked pointed questions about the silver mine. Presently, Bigfoot began to laugh and talk incoherently about the trick the Cherokee had played on the white man. When Grant asked him what he meant, the Indian told an intriguing tale. Many years ago, he said, white men had heard about the silver mine of the Cherokee and came to the Silver Creek Valley in search of it. Like Grant, all they found were the remains of the old smelters. The Cherokee, according to Bigfoot, took all the silver from the mine and secreted it inside a large hollowed-out rock some distance away. For many days and nights, the Indians worked in the mine, digging out the silver and smelting it with their crude equipment. Bigfoot said they dug 20 mule loads of the ore before moving it. Now, while many Indians dug the silver, several others hollowed out an opening in a boulder large enough to hold all the silver. Once the bags of ore were placed in the hollow boulder, a large slab of the same kind of rock was placed over the opening. The Indians swore to each other to keep secret the true story of the silver and to punish by death any violation of the oath. They let the white men believe they had merely covered the mine, leaving the silver inside, and let them search for it. Now over the years, Cherokees who knew of the treasure-filled boulder would occasionally retrieve some ore to make bullets and jewelry. When Grant asked Bigfoot where the hollowed-out rock was, the drunken Cherokee pulled an old, weathered, grimy deerskin map from his pocket and handed it to the youth. The map contained Indian symbols, and though it was hard to read, Grant could make out some familiar landmarks. Now while the boy was reading the map, the big Indian fell asleep in a stupor. For nearly 2 hours, Grant studied the map, memorizing the marked trails, mountain peaks, ridges, and streams. Presently, the Indian awoke and saw the boy holding the map. Bigfoot asked Grant if he had told him the story of the hidden Cherokee silver. The boy replied that he had and handed the map back to him. Bigfoot held out an open palm and told the boy to keep the map. He said he had broken a tribal code by revealing the information and would likely be killed for it. He told Grant to hide the map and never let anyone know he possessed it, or he too would be killed. The boy promised to hide the map and keep the secret. Now Bigfoot bid the lad goodbye and staggered into the woods. 2 weeks later, his body was found about a mile from the Grant cabin. The big Indian's throat had been cut from ear to ear, and a knife had been thrust into his chest up to the hilt. The death of Bigfoot had a devastating effect on young Grant, because he and the Indian had been close friends. The boy grieved for many weeks, but the resilience of youth finally won out, and life returned to normal. True to his promise, Grant told no one about the treasure map and kept it hidden. Many years later, when Grant was grown, he dug the map out of its hiding place and undertook a search for the silver cache. Following the directions on the old cracked deerskin, Grant went right to the boulder, lifted the covering rock, and saw the many leather sacks filled with silver lying in the hollowed out chamber. Grant spent an entire afternoon sitting on top of the boulder wondering what to do with this vast fortune. In the end, he covered it up and left it where it was. Years later, when asked how he could walk away from such great wealth, he replied without hesitation that it was simply not his treasure. It belonged to the Cherokee, he said. They mined it, they labored hard and long to move it to the hollowed out rock, and they guarded it over the years. At first, he said, he was afraid the Indians would somehow find out if he removed some of the silver, and he would die a horrible death like his friend Bigfoot. But in the end, he believed it was simply not rightfully his to take. The map, Grant said, was in an old trunk filled with belongings, and he intended to leave it there. Now, in the fall of 1954, W.I. Grant passed away at age 73. A friend of Grant's, who knew the story of the Cherokee silver, asked his widow about the map. She had no idea where it was. Now, when the friend told her Grant had said he kept it in an old trunk, she explained apologetically that the trunk and everything in it had been burned right after the funeral. Unless some Cherokees still live who remember, the secret of the great cache of silver somewhere on Silver Creek near the Nantala Gorge died with W.I. Grant. Many remember there was a silver mine, but few know that the great wealth of precious metal was removed and hidden in a huge hollowed out boulder. Most of that, 20 mule loads of almost pure silver, is still there. This one's pots of Confederate gold. Toward the end of 1864, it was becoming painfully clear to the Confederate Army that the war was winding down and they were losing. Some Southern generals, foreseeing the inevitable outcome, came to be more interested in salvaging what was left of the Confederate treasury than in winning battles. To that end, much of the Southern Army's wealth, intended to purchase arms, ammunition, and riding stock, was hurriedly hidden in various places below the Mason-Dixon line. Some of this wealth was later retrieved, but most of it, perhaps several $1 million worth of gold and silver coins, remains hidden. One such cache was an incredibly rich store of gold held in a temporary treasury headquarters in Richmond, Virginia, during the war. When it became clear that the days of the Confederacy were outnumbered, military leaders decided to hide the gold so it would not fall into the hands of Union forces. Captain J.W. Duchase, commander of Company C of the 4th Mississippi Infantry, stationed in Richmond, was charged with removing the South's store of gold coins to another state and burying them in predetermined locations. Now, Duchase was roused from his sleep around 2 o'clock one crisp autumn morning in 1864 and told to report to headquarters. There he found officers and aides frantically preparing to abandon the area in the wake of the news that the Yankees were closing in. Duchase, along with his entire company, was ordered to report to the railway station at 6:30 that evening. Each man was to bring 3 days' worth of rations, at least 40 rounds of ammunition, and full marching gear. That evening, Captain Duchase and the 78 fighting men from Mississippi who made up his infantry company assembled at the station platform. The train had 4 boxcars and 3 flat cars. The boxcars contained arms, ammunition, and other material the Confederate leaders thought prudent to ship out. The end flat car held a 3-inch bore field piece, some other armament, and a detachment of gunners. Now the 2 remaining flat cars were loaded with iron cooking pots, each filled with gold coins, each lid tightly fastened with wire. As Duchase waited near the train, he was delivered a set of orders and told to open them when he arrived at his assigned destination, Greensboro, North Carolina. Now Duchase's notes on the incident explain what occurred next. We traveled all night and reached Greensboro the next day at 4 p.m. There I opened my orders and found the following instructions. You are to proceed the following night to McLeansville by way of the North Carolina Railroad. After leaving McLeansville, you will bury these pots in groups of 3 on each side of the railroad and not over 100 paces from the right-of-way. In case there are houses nearby, proceed further. Also, plot the burial places as nearly as possible. Duchase and his men followed the orders to the letter, burying the pots in lots of 3. In all, they covered about 16 miles along the railroad tracks between Greensboro and company shops, later renamed Burlington. Their mission complete, Duchase and his infantry company rode the train into company shops, turned the train around, and returned to Greensboro. From Greensboro, they went by another train toward Richmond to submit the information on the locations of the buried Confederate gold and to aid the defense of that city against Yankee attack. Along the way, however, the train was derailed by a Union blockade, and most of Company C was captured. Duchase and one lieutenant escaped, but they lost the description of the burial locations in doing so. The 2 men lived in hiding for several weeks and were forced to steal and beg food from the isolated farms they found in the area. Union troops eventually found Duchase and his companion. The 2 men, near starvation, were huddling under a fallen log. They surrendered to the Yankees, were interrogated, and waited out the remainder of the war in a prison camp. When the South surrendered, Duchase, along with thousands of other captured rebels, was freed. He went to Mexico and got involved in mining and real estate. He prospered over the years from several successful ventures, married a Mexican woman, and raised a family. Duchase sometimes thought of returning to North Carolina for the Confederate gold he had buried. The former infantry captain believed he remembered enough of the area between Greensboro and McLeansville to locate the treasure easily. Now, business concerns and family matters, however, occupied his time, and he could not travel. Now, while living in Mexico, Duchase wrote extensive notes in a journal about the war in general and his assignment to conceal the Confederate gold in particular. His descriptions of where he hid the gold-filled iron cooking pots were clear and precise. More years passed. Duchase's wealth grew, and his desire to return to the United States waned. His notes on the war, along with the account of the buried Confederate gold, were given to a man named P.H. Black, a former Greensboro resident who met Duchase in Mexico in the 1890s. Now, when Duchase learned Black was from North Carolina, he told him the story. Before Black left Mexico, Duchase gave him all his notes about it. Duchase died in Mexico around the turn of the century, having never left since he first arrived in 1865. Now, P.H. Black died in North Carolina in the 1930s, and no one knows what became of Duchase's notes, nor does anyone know whether Black ever tried to retrieve any of the gold. If he did not find all of it. During the 1880s, Burlington grew into an important settlement in that part of the Appalachian Piedmont. In the fields and meadows along the old North Carolina Railroad tracks, farmers met the growing demand for cotton and corn. Late one summer afternoon in 1910, a black farmhand was plowing in a field about 3 miles west of Burlington. The horse-drawn plowing was tedious and the day was hot. Both man and horse were tired and looking forward to quitting time when the steel plow struck something hard, breaking its point. The farmhand dug into the ground and retrieved a rusted iron cooking pot wrapped tightly with thick wire. He wrestled the heavy pot to the surface, and when he removed the wire and the lid, he was surprised to find it filled to the top with $20 gold pieces. The farmhand was about 100 paces from the old railroad tracks. Not knowing the true value of the coins, the farmhand took several into Burlington the next day and traded them for dimes. The $20 gold pieces aroused local curiosity, and the laborer was asked about his discovery. Before sundown of that same day, the cornfield was swarming with men digging the rich soil for other pots. Within 2 feet of the first iron pot, the landowner found 2 others, though he never told anyone the value of his discovery. From that day on, he was a wealthy man. The 3 pots of gold were found in the cornfield by luck and accident. Others may have been recovered, but if so, it has never been recorded. Most likely, hundreds of the iron cooking pots, each filled with gold coins, are still buried near the old railroad tracks for well over 120 years. A king's ransom has lain hidden in the fields under a few inches of North Carolina soil. The cursed cache of the Uwharrie Mountains. In west central North Carolina, about 50 miles south of Greensboro, lie the Uwharrie Mountains, an ancient subdivision of the Appalachians. Geologists have written that the Uwharries might be the oldest range on the North American continent and at one time reached altitudes surpassing any found today in the Rockies. Because of their great age, the Uwharries have eroded over time, the once majestic peaks now worn down into no more than rounded knobs, hills, and ridges. Anthropologists and archaeologists tell us that some 10,000 years ago these mountains were populated by an Indian tribe that left complex burial mounds suggestive of elaborate rituals and ceremonies. Why the early Indians abandoned the region, no one knows, but they inspired a rich lore of folk tales and legends of demons, spirits, ghosts, and witches, all of which allegedly haunt the range to this day. Now, in 1835, a man named Francis J. Cron came to the Uwharrie Mountains from somewhere in Europe. Cron had arrived on the East Coast several years earlier, had repeatedly run into trouble with the law, and had finally moved westward. He eventually came to the Uwharrie Mountains, traveling alone and on foot. For months, Cron lived deep in the woods, appearing on rare occasions at small area settlements to purchase supplies. Cron was a dark-complected, sharp-featured, angular man with shoulder-length black hair. Though he claimed to be a doctor, it is doubtful he ever received a medical education from any established institution. A few of the local residents, though, let Cron doctor their ailments, and they reported his methods of treatment were bizarre, using wild herbs and strange powders and sing-song chanting in a language no one understood. Many of the area residents began to believe that Cron was evil and that he was somehow linked with the mountain demons, spirits, and curses of the old folk tales. Within a few years, Cron married a local woman, a wealthy widow, and immediately purchased a plantation near what is now the town of Albemarle. Cron built a mansion, bought numerous slaves to work on his farm, and prospered. A few months after the wedding, Cron's wife disappeared and was never seen again. No explanation was ever offered. Visitors to the Cron mansion were never greeted and often left without seeing a soul on the farm. Stories of bonfires and odd ceremonies on the Cron plantation spread throughout the area. Now, around 1879, Cron hired a man named Dan Compton to do odd jobs around the plantation. Now, Compton lived in one of the old slave cabins and took his meals with the hired help. Once Cron ordered Compton into a dark room deep in the mansion and showed him a large keg standing in the center of the room. The top of the keg was nailed shut and heavy steel bands were secured tightly around the oak staves. Cron told Compton to roll the keg into the middle of one of the large fields. The keg was heavy and unwieldy, but Compton managed to wrestle it from the house and roll it to the prescribed site. Accompanied by the evil-looking Cron, as he rolled the keg along the ground, Compton noted that it jingled as if it were filled with coins. About halfway to the field, Compton pleaded with Cron to let him to rest. The plantation owner granted the handyman a few moments to catch his breath, and as Compton sat on the tipped-over keg, he noticed a small space between two of the oak staves. He saw that the keg was filled with gold coins. Compton assumed Cron intended to bury the keg of coins. When the two men arrived at the designated site, Cron told Compton to set the keg upright and pile some boards around it. Nearby were 3 torn-down slave shacks, and from them, Compton took dozens of pieces of milled lumber, stacking them around the keg as ordered. When Compton finished, Cron ordered the handyman to leave and never return to the site. That evening, Compton was awakened by the sound of loud chanting. From the doorway of his cabin, he could see a huge bonfire out in the large field where he had rolled the keg of gold coins. He could just make out human figures leaping and swaying to some primitive rhythm. Slipping on pants and shoes, Compton crept closer to the fire, keeping to the trees at the edge of the field. Now when he stopped some 50 yards from the blaze, where he could observe the goings-on, he saw Cron and several Indians he had never seen before dancing naked around the huge fire and chanting in a language he had never heard. In the middle of the blaze, the wooden staves of the keg were burning away and the gold coins were beginning to melt. Ochre streams of molten metal flowed lazily from the pyre, and then cooled into shapeless masses. As the gold melted, the screams and chants of the dancers grew louder and more passionate. Frightened and appalled, Compton fled from the scene. Reaching his cabin, he snatched up his few possessions and left the Uwaris never to return. Years later, on his deathbed, Compton related for the first time the story of that strange autumn night of 1878. Asked why he had never told it before, he said he was afraid of Cron, afraid that he was some kind of demon and had the power to call down the terrible curse on him. Magic and witchcraft were a powerful part of the beliefs of many people in those days, and Compton, who was susceptible to such notions, never returned to the plantation for any of the gold he was certain still lay in the field. Now the old Cron place was just northwest of present-day Morrow Mountain State Park. The field on which Cron had held the strange rituals lies between a small unnamed creek and the Louder Ferry Road. Immediately south of the field is Hadaway Mountain. Somewhere near the center of that field, beneath a few inches of soil, likely lies a shapeless mass of gold worth millions of dollars. Now we're going to talk about the Outlaw Treasure Cave near Hendersonville. For years, caves have been favored haunts of outlaws. Caves were normally far removed from settlements and thus afforded isolation. Caves offered simple yet effective protection from the elements. They were cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and caves were ideal places to hide loot. One such cave exists in Henderson County. History reveals that this cave often served as a temporary home for renegades and as a repository for stolen gold, silver, and currency. History has not, however, revealed whether any of the hidden treasure has been recovered from this cave. Now, the story of the Henderson County treasure cave came to light with the discovery of the diary of Lieutenant J.W. Hadley, a Union officer. Now, Hadley's company fought Confederate forces during the famous Battle of the Wilderness in 1864 in eastern Virginia. Now, early in the fighting, Hadley was wounded and captured, and along with hundreds of other Union prisoners, shipped by rail to Columbia, South Carolina, where he was interned in a prison camp. The prison camp was a makeshift assemblage of poorly constructed shacks in a disease-ridden swamp. Each day, men died from dysentery and malaria, and Hadley and 3 companions plotted to escape the dreadful confinement. Now, one night, the 4 men fled the prison and, once out of range of pursuit, undertook the long journey northward, hoping to encounter Union forces. For days, the men slunk through the woods, keeping to low areas and dense brush to avoid being seen. Sometimes they hid from roving patrols of rebel soldiers. Where they could get them, the men fed on wild berries and small game. The difficult travel, the hunger, and the hiding slowed the fugitives' journey, and an unusually cold autumn overtook them as they crossed the border into North Carolina. With the frigid temperatures, wild berries were scarce, and the men resorted to stealing frost-killed vegetables from gardens on the outskirts of small communities. In one raid on a garden patch, the 4 men were surprised by the arrival of 3 women who had come to harvest greens. The women were armed, and while the fugitives were held at gunpoint, the youngest ran back up the trail in search of help. Presently, a tall, bearded old man returned with the young woman. He was carrying a rifle and had a vengeful gleam in his eye. He noted the ragged and torn Union blue uniforms on the haggard men and told them he had no use for Yankees or thieves. Hadley and his companions dropped to their knees and pleaded for their lives, swearing they intended no harm and only wanted to get food and leave the region as soon as possible. The old man took pity on the starved, ragged soldiers. Though he was a bred in the bone Southerner who believed in the Confederate cause, and had lost 2 sons to Union bullets, the man lowered his rifle and invited the fugitives to his cabin, where he saw to it they were fed a proper meal. During dinner, the host suggested to Hadley it might be prudent to hire a guide to lead them to Union Sanctuary. He said he knew a man who might deliver them to Knoxville for $100 in gold coins. Hadley agreed. The man was sent for, and he arrived at the cabin late the next day. The newcomer was a quiet, thin, dark man whose black bowler hat shadowed his face. After listening to the fugitive's tale of escape and flight, he agreed to let Hadley pay him the $100 on arrival at Knoxville, since none of the escapees had any money. He told the 4 he would return with horses after sundown the next evening. The following night, a quiet knock at the cabin door preceded a deep voice announcing that all was ready and they must depart at once. When Hadley and his companions assembled outside the cabin, the guide told them they would be blindfolded and that they would soon understand the reason for the precaution. Each was helped onto a horse and they were led into the woods. As they rode along, Hadley made mental notes of the journey. He recalled later that while he didn't know which way they went on leaving the cabin, they were on horseback for about an hour, and he recalled that they crossed 2 shallow creeks near the end of the ride. Eventually, the guide called a halt, and the 4 blindfolded men were helped off their horses. After a brief hike up a moderately steep gravel slope, they were led to a guide rope. Following the rope, the men came into what was unmistakably a large cave. After several more minutes of walking, they were ordered to halt and their blindfolds were removed. Hadley saw they were in a large torchlit chamber. He could hear water dripping some distance away and occasionally heard voices coming from some far passageway. Against one wall of the cave were piled several saddlebags and chests. The guide handed each man a blanket and told them to sleep, as they would depart early in the morning. They would have this chamber to themselves, he said, but they were not to leave it. He told them a guard was stationed in the passageway with orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape. During the night, Hadley found it difficult to sleep. He threw off his blanket, removed one of the burning torches from a niche in the cave wall, and explored the chamber. When he arrived at the pile of saddlebags and chests in the far corner, he regarded them with interest. Hadley noted the chests were of the type railroad companies used to transport gold, silver, and currency. Bending to one of the saddlebags, he unfastened the straps and peered within. His heart pounded as he saw what must have been hundreds of gold coins. He opened several more of the packs and found gold or silver coins in each. He guessed the chests held a fortune in gold and silver as well. Hadley began to understand the reason for the blindfolds. He and his companions were being held in a cave used by bandits to store treasure. Hadley returned to his blanket, but could not sleep. Early the next morning, 6 rough-looking men entered the chamber. Each was carrying a heavy saddlebag, which was added to the pile against the far wall. Pretending to sleep, Hadley listened to the conversations of the newcomers and learned that they were robbers and smugglers, and that the cave was indeed a repository for their booty. A few minutes later, the guide came and told the 4 fugitives it was time to leave. The 6 newly arrived men would go with them to Knoxville. He said since they were all headed that way anyways. Hadley and his companions were once again blindfolded and led from the cave. Outside, they were ordered to rest near a grove of trees while their hosts sealed the entrance. As he waited, Hadley managed to adjust his blindfold so he could see what the workers were doing. The bandits piled boulders in front of the low cave entrance, covering it and making it look much like the rest of the talus-covered slope. When this was done, the outlaws gathered in front of the camouflaged entrance and swore an oath of secrecy about the location of the treasure cave. Presently, all were mounted and riding north. After about a mile, the guide told the soldiers they could remove their blindfolds. After doing so, Hadley glanced about for prominent landmarks, but he could see was the dense grove of beech trees where they had stopped, and a small creek across which was a thick oak forest. The rest of the journey was uneventful, and a few days later they reached the outskirts of Knoxville in a Union Army camp. The bandits held one of the fugitives hostage and told Hadley and the two others to go into the camp and get the promised $100. Hadley and his companions were escorted to the tent of a company commander, where they told the incredible story of their capture, escape, and flight through the southern countryside. After some initial disbelief, the officer accepted Hadley's tale and told his aide to bring him $100. There was no gold in the camp, and the aide came back with paper currency. The commander told Hadley to offer the bandits the currency and sent him off in the company of 2 armed soldiers. The bandits were understandably nervous when Hadley returned in the company of the armed escort. But when they saw the fee was in paper money instead of gold, they were furious. Hadley explained there was no gold in the camp and pleaded for the outlaws to take the money. The discussion grew heated, and one of the bandits pulled a gun and fired at a trooper, killing him instantly. While Hadley and the hostage ducked for cover, the outlaws fired at the second trooper, who took shelter behind a tree. Frustrated, the outlaws reined their horses around and dashed back to the south. Hearing the commotion, the company commander assembled 24 troops and set out in pursuit of the outlaws. About 5 miles from the hostage exchange site, the soldiers overtook the fleeing desperados and a gunfight ensued. After a half hour of exchanging gunfire, all of the outlaws and 3 of the Union troopers lay dead. When the outcome was reported to Hadley later in the day, he realized that all the men who knew where the treasure cave was had died with the secret. When the war ended, Hadley returned to Henderson County to seek the treasure cave. With some difficulty, he found the small farm where he and his companions were first discovered. He looked up the old farmer who had fed them and arranged their escape and thanked him for saving their lives. Now Hadley was sure the treasure cave was still sealed and the gold and silver coins lay untouched deep within the large chamber where he had first seen them. He set up a small camp near the cabin and spent the next several weeks walking and riding through the forest in search of the cave. With no visual landmarks to guide him, Hadley had trouble retracing the route he had followed blindfolded 2 years earlier. After successive failures, he finally gave up and went home. Hadley returned to Henderson County many times over the next 20 years, but each trip was no more successful than the one before it, and he never found the elusive cave. On his deathbed, Hadley said he was certain the cave had never been reopened and the treasure was still intact. Others have tried to follow Hadley's directions to the hoard, but to date, none of it has been recovered. Alright, this one's the Lost Keg of Gold. Deep in a forgotten gold mine in the Union County, in the Union County region of South Carolina Appalachians, rests an old nail keg half filled with gold mined from a rich vein. The keg of gold, along with its owner, were buried in an 1858 cave-in, and all attempts to retrieve the fortune have failed. 2 years before the Civil War, life in the Piedmont region of South Carolina was slow and uneventful. An easy peace lay across the mountains, the valley, and the area farms. As it would for years to come, cotton reigned. Large landowners with plenty of slaves were wealthy and powerful. Asa Smith was one such landowner. He had 3,000 acres of rich farmland that, with the help of his 100 slaves, produced healthy crops of cotton each year. Now Smith was hard on his slaves, just as likely to whip them as to look at them. One of the slaves, a tall, strong, older man, Smith, called Blue, was a particular favorite because he was a natural leader and just as hard a taskmaster as his owner. Smith elevated Blue to foreman and charged him with the daily operation of the cotton farm. Now in the winter, when the fields lay fallow, Smith worked his slaves in the nearby Hopkins mine. The mine had operated for several years and been productive, but poor management had caused it to close down. Smith took out a lease on the mine, and when his cotton was in, he put his slaves to work digging gold. Smith and Blue would wake the slaves before dawn and, following behind in a horse-drawn wagon, run them the 2 miles to the mine where they would work until sundown. Many slaves died in the mine, but neither the owner nor the foreman showed any mercy. Each morning, as Blue was readying the slaves, Smith loaded an old nail keg into the wagon. Gold dug from the mine went in the keg. Soon it was too heavy for Smith to lift into the wagon by himself. and Blue was enlisted to help. As more gold was added to the keg, it got so heavy that Smith began keeping it at the mine. Deep in the gold mine and alongside one of the main shafts, Smith had his slaves dig a chamber which he referred to as his room. The low-ceilinged little room was sparsely furnished with a wooden table and chair. Here, Smith would sort and weigh his gold before adding it to the store in the keg. Now, Smith oversaw the work done by the slaves, recommending the excavation of new shafts and supervising the cleaning and processing of the gold. At the end of each day, Smith would have Blue line up the slaves and check their hair to make certain no gold was caught or cached in it. This done, the slaves were marched back to the plantation. March of 1859 was wetter than normal. It rained hard every day. Parts of the Hopkins mine flooded, and Smith put several slaves to hand pumping the knee-deep water out of several shafts. To compound the problems, one of the main shafts suffered a minor cave-in. As March wore on, Smith was still adding gold to his growing fortune. The keg was now a little more than half full. While sorting the gold one afternoon in his room, Smith called for his foreman, who came running. Smith, standing ankle-deep in water, told Blue he was feeling chilled and sent him to the wagon for his coat. When the foreman reached the wagon, parked about 100 feet from the mine entrance, he heard a loud rumble and felt the earth shake. He turned back toward the entrance and saw a great cloud of dust roll from the shaft and disperse into the clear outside air. Blue ran to the entrance, calling through the thick dust hanging in the shaft. Several slaves came stumbling and crawling out of the shaft and told him a cave-in had destroyed a large section of the mine, killed many of the workers, and completely buried the chamber where Smith was counting his gold. Blue leaped into the wagon and drove rapidly to the plantation, where he told Smith's wife Sarah of the accident. She told the foreman to get some of the neighbors and try to reach the chamber to see if Asa could be rescued. Within hours, about 24 people had gathered at the entrance of the old Hopkins mine. An exploratory party of several men entered the shaft but came out after only a few minutes, telling the gathering crowd that the cave-in had destroyed most of the mine and no one could have possibly survived. Now, over the years, several attempts were made to excavate the collapsed rock and debris from the old Hopkins mine to retrieve Asa Smith's keg of gold. While tons of material have been removed from the first 100 feet of the original shaft, most of the passageways remain filled. Asa Smith's chamber, according to Blue, was about 1,000 feet deep in the mine, and the room that held the keg of the gold and Asa Smith's bones was blocked by tons of debris. An excavation company tried to reopen the mine in the early 1930s, but was defeated by the tons of rock it would have to remove. The workers were also constantly threatened with new cave-ins. Somewhere deep in the old Hopkins mine, in a room carved out of mountain rock, like a mausoleum, a nail keg, half filled with gold, lies next to the bones of Asa Smith. The Indian gold mine DeSoto never found. One of the most fascinating and enduring lost mine legends in South Carolina tells of a rich lode of gold known to the local Indians and at one time sought by the famed Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto. The mine, probably in present-day Pickens County, was never found by the intrepid de Soto, and for centuries it was apparently a primary source of the gold used by several area Indian tribes to make fine jewelry, ornaments, and icons. As de Soto traveled and explored the southern Appalachians, he thought always of his mission to locate, excavate, and ship back to Spain any and all kinds of precious metals. When he stumbled across a gold or silver mine operated by Indians, he would often enslave the members of the tribe and force them to dig the ore for Spain. If the Indians resisted, de Soto would kill several of the tribe's leaders as an example. Thus, the gold-hungry Spaniard subjugated, tortured, and killed hundreds of Indians in his quest for wealth for the Spanish king. At an Indian village called Nepetaca in what is now southern Georgia, a young Indian who was about to be tortured by de Soto's men pleaded for mercy, telling his captors he knew of a wealthy gold mine in the mountains several marches to the north. The mine was supposed to be a 3-day ride from a large Indian village called Coffetakiki, which was ruled by a queen. The soldiers brought the young man to DeSoto, and the explorer listened with interest to the story. He decided to go to Takiki and ordered his men to get ready to leave immediately. DeSoto had one of his priests baptize the young Indian, gave him the Christian name of Peter, and incorporated him into his army. The Spanish force left Nepetaca in March 1540 and for several weeks traveled north through the plains, forests, and swamps of the humid lowlands. Provisions were running dangerously low, hunting was poor, and the progress and morale of the party was deteriorating rapidly. Whenever the Spaniards sighted an Indian village, they would prepare to raid it for food and women, only to find each time it was infested with smallpox brought to the region by an earlier Spanish explorer, Vasquez de Leon. DeSoto's army gave each such village a wide berth. Several times DeSoto was ready to abandon the quest for the mine, but young Peter always reassured him that the waiting riches would make the toil and sacrifices worthwhile. But after weeks of weary marching and being forced to eat dogs and horses, an angry and frustrated DeSoto ordered the young Indian killed. Juan Ortiz, DeSoto's chief interpreter, argued for Peter's life, saying that the boy's knowledge of the local language would prove useful and could mean the difference between life and death. DeSoto relented, and 4 days later, the young Indian led the party of Spaniards to the outskirts of Takiki. The village lay spread along the floodplain of the Savannah River about a dozen miles downstream from present-day Augusta, Georgia, on the South Carolina side of the river. The village housed large families in its many circular earthen structures and had been spared the smallpox epidemic that had decimated tribes farther south. The inhabitants of Takiki were friendly, cultured, and courteous. As DeSoto and his men rode into the village, they were warmly greeted by the Indians and invited to a welcoming feast. The Spaniards were brought gifts of fresh water, pearls, fine furs, and food. Looking around at the Indian population, DeSoto noticed much gold. Many of the Indians were wearing armbands, rings, and ornate headpieces made from it. Now during the feast, the queen of the village came to the Spanish leader. DeSoto wrote in his journals that the queen was tall, almost statuesque, light of color, and very attractive. DeSoto called the queen La Señora, and he thanked her when she personally welcomed the Spaniards and invited them to set up camp near the village. Playing the role of the grateful guest, DeSoto agreed to remain for a few days, but uppermost in his mind was gold. A casual walk through the Indian village revealed that the dwellings and temples were filled with gold icons and ornaments. DeSoto even saw ceremonial axe blades and spearheads made from the precious metal. He asked for and was granted an audience with La Señora, and during this conversation, he asked where the wealth he saw in the village had come from. The queen would not be specific, but did tell the Spaniard that for many generations the Indians had excavated gold from a mine in the mountains to the north. She claimed the mine had an unending supply of the precious ore and would provide the metal for her people for centuries to come. That evening, greed overtaking gratitude, DeSoto made plans to kidnap La Señora and force her to guide him to the mine. At dawn the following day, the Spanish soldiers swarmed into the village, sacked the temples, and seized the queen and several of her followers. DeSoto told La Señora that she was to guide him and his army to the rich gold mine in the north, and they would all be tortured and killed. The queen and her followers agreed to show the Spaniard the mine, and the party began to wind its way through the low foothills of western South Carolina toward the higher reaches of the mountains looming miles ahead of them. Progress was slowed dramatically when spring rains struck the second day of the journey. Torrents fell for days on the Spanish army and its captives, making travel nearly impossible. Flood waters washed out trails, and the company got lost more than once. Rivers were often too high and swift to ford, forcing the travelers to wait days to cross. The horses were slowed by the soft muck of the trails, and word had spread to Indian villages north of Takiki that the queen had been taken by the Spaniards, and each time the army approached a village, they were met with hostility and sometimes attacked. Several soldiers were killed, food again became scarce, and De Soto's confidence began to suffer. Now the journey that was to take only days dragged into weeks. The Spaniards were weary and frustrated, and De Soto was beginning to worry about dissension. The soldiers were tired of difficult marching and going days without food. The men guarding the Queen and her subordinates grew more careless each day, and one evening, La Señora and her followers saw their chance and escaped. De Soto, having lost his hostage and guide to the rich gold mine, became discouraged and surly. Fearing he would soon lose control of his army, he ordered them to abandon the quest. Turning their backs on the Appalachian Mountains, the party of explorers marched west toward the lowlands, reaching the Mississippi River many weeks later. Now scholars, prospectors, geologists, and students of this tale of a lost gold mine in the South Carolina Appalachians have often debated whether the lode really exists, but some facts support that it does. First, there was an abundance of gold in the village of Coffetakiki. Second, the Indians had little reason for lying about the source of the ore, for to them it was used merely for ornaments and ceremony and had no value as a medium of exchange. Third, gold has been found elsewhere in the South Carolina Appalachians. There are impressive deposits in both Pickens and York counties. De Soto was probably only a day or two from the famed Indian gold mine from the Appalachians, but the hardship of his journey, coupled with the escape of his prisoners, caused him to abandon the quest. Now the incident was the first of the difficulties and bad luck that would plague the Spanish leader. While his party did cross the wide Mississippi River and find gold in the Ozark and Ouachita Mountains to the west, De Soto's health was starting to deteriorate. Many of his soldiers deserted, several with fortunes in gold and silver gained in the expedition. Eventually, De Soto became delirious and had to be carried on a litter. The Spaniard, an important early explorer of the southern United States, died somewhere near the Arkansas-Louisiana border while trying to get back to Spain. The lost mine of the South Carolina Appalachians was said to be a rich source of almost pure gold for the local Indians, who were probably members of the Creek tribe. When the area was abandoned during the infamous Trail of Tears resettlement, the mine was closed and probably covered over. Many have searched for it over the past century and a half, yet it remains lost. Alright, silver mine in Pickens County. Gold lured De Soto to explore western and northwestern South Carolina, and according to the tales and legends passed down over the centuries, gold was indeed plentiful. Silver, however, was equally abundant and, like the fabled gold, eludes modern-day treasure hunters. One legend of lost silver from this region tells of a small exploration party of Spaniards, most likely a detachment from De Soto's army under the leadership of Juan de Villalobos, that dug ore from a hillside by an Indian village near the present-day junction of Anderson, Oconee, and Pickens counties. The Spaniards asked permission from the Indians to mine the silver. It was freely granted. During the following few weeks, the Spaniards bartered their possessions to the Indians for food. The vein of silver the Spaniards followed into the rock was so rich that excavating it left them no time to hunt for food. Soon, though, the newcomers ran out of items to trade to the Indians. The leader of the Spanish mining expedition ordered the Indians to hunt and fish for his men, but they refused. Enraged, de Villalobos enslaved them, tortured and killed many, forced the rest to work in the mine, and stole their stores of food. During the roundup of slaves, several Indians escaped into the woods and fled to a neighboring village. There, the refugees told what had happened, and the Indians plotted to attack the Spaniards, free their brothers, and drive the intruders from the country. Weeks went by, and the Spaniards grew complacent. Never threatened, they saw little need to post guards. One night, by the light of a full moon, a large force of Indians crept through the woods to the Spaniards' bivouac and slew them all in their blankets. They carried the bodies deep into the mine shaft and covered the entrance. The Indians thereafter regarded the site as evil and cursed, and they moved their village far away. The story of the rich silver mine was told and retold over successive generations, becoming part of the tribal folklore. but the location of the mine eventually faded from the memory of the Indians and remains a mystery. Now, in 1670, an expedition led by Dr. Henry Woodward arrived at the village of Cofetakeeke on the Savannah River. Woodward, a wealthy British physician, explorer, and ambassador to the New World, befriended the Indians he found in the large settlement and earned their trust. So completely was he incorporated into the tribe that he was given lodging, food, and a prominent place on the village council. Woodward was familiar with the story of De Soto's visit to Cofetakeeke more than 100 years earlier and the ill-fated search for the gold mine. Woodward asked several of the Cofetakeeke residents about the tale and was assured every word of it was true, and that, in fact, gold was still being taken in great quantities from the mine. While living in Cofetakeeke, Woodward also noted an abundance of silver jewelry, icons, and ornaments. When he asked about the source of this ore, he was told that it came from a mine very near the legendary gold mine. During his stay, Woodward learned approximately where the Indians' gold and silver mines lay. But as he was preparing an expedition to the area, he took sick and died within days. Many believe that the Indians, learning of Woodward's plans to search for their mines, poisoned his food. Now, in 1760, during the French and Indian War, a company of British soldiers was returning from a skirmish with hostile Cherokee when they camped on the banks of Little Wilson's Creek adjacent to the Kiowa Trail. While encamped, several soldiers noticed some intriguing color in the local rock formations and dug out chunks as souvenirs. The war kept the soldiers occupied for months thereafter, and when the conflict wound down, the company disbanded and its members dispersed. Later, several men who had dug pieces of the brightly colored rock from the stone matrix near Little Wilson Creek discovered that it was almost pure silver. Now, the former soldiers organized successive attempts to find the original site of their discovery, but always failed. Now, the silver is believed to have been found near Pointing Rock, which is just south of Old Stone Church near Little Wilson's Creek in the western corner of Pickens County. Now, around 1815, a Cherokee family was known to have mined pure silver near the settlement of Cheyenne Rock, now a ghost town not far from present-day Clemson. The Indians would sometimes sell the silver to travelers and passers-by, but during the 1820s they disappeared. They may have been killed for their presumed wealth and their bodies hidden in a mine, but the truth was never known. Years later, visitors to Cheyenne Rock reported finding nuggets of raw silver as well as small clots of the smelted ore. No one has found the source of the Cherokee family's silver, though many have searched. During the late 1850s, two separate mining companies sank shafts in the area, seeking a vein of silver they suspected was just below the surface. Now, both reported failure. Just a year after the two companies withdrew from the region, a small contingent of miners from Charleston arrived, established a well-provisioned camp, located some silver, and successfully mined it for 2 years. Operations ceased when the war between the states broke out. It is not known what became of the miners, but after the war, the abandoned shafts were not reopened, and no one ever came forward to renew the claim.